You can try something very simple right now. Close your eyes and ask yourself, who were the people who dominated America during the Gilded Age? Almost certainly, familiar names will come to mind. Vanderbilt with railroads, Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, Morgan with finance. These people have become icons. They appear in textbooks, in documentaries, in stories about the American dream. And it is this familiarity that has led us to misunderstand the nature of power during this period. Because the Gilded Age wasn't ruled by the most famous people. It was ruled by people you'd barely heard of. People who didn't build factories, didn't own oil fields, didn't inaugurate railroads, didn't cut ribbons at grand ceremonies. They didn't stand on stage. They built the stage. And when you understand that, the whole way you see this era is turned upside down. Industrial tycoons are indeed very rich. But wealth doesn't equate to control of the system. You can own an empire, but if the law doesn't allow you to expand, that empire will stop. You can have a large market share, but if capital flows are blocked, you can't grow. You can employ tens of thousands of workers, but if the local government refuses to grant permits, your project will die on paper. True power doesn't lie in what you own, but in what you are allowed to do. The Gilded Age was a period when America transitioned from a loosely competitive economy to an unprecedentedly centralized one. Hundreds of businesses merged into a few dozen giant corporations. Entire industries were placed under the control of a very small group. But that transformation could not have happened solely through business acumen or personal ambition. It required something far more sophisticated. A restructuring of law, finance, and politics so that the concentration of power would be legitimate, smooth, and sustainable. And this is where popular history often overlooks the point. We are told stories of great individuals because they are easy to remember, easy to tell, easy to mythologize. But those who truly controlled the Gilded Age understood something very different. The most enduring power is power that doesn't need to be seen. They didn't seek fame. On the contrary, they actively avoided the spotlight. They didn't want their names in newspapers. They didn't want monuments or libraries bearing their names. They wanted their influence to blend into the structure of the system, to the point where it looked obvious, natural, and not designed by anyone. Consider this. Vanderbilt may have built railroads, but he didn't write laws that made railroads a legitimate monopoly. Rockefeller may have controlled Standard Oil, but he didn't invent the legal structure that would make a cartel a legitimate entity in court. Carnegie may have produced steel cheaper than anyone else, but he didn't create the tariff system that protected American steel from foreign competition. Behind every titan on the stage, there's always another group, more discreet, but who dictates the rules of the game. Who are these people? They are lawyers, who not only interpret the law, but rewrite it. They are banks and financiers, who not only lend, but decide who gets access to capital and who gets cut off when a crisis strikes. And they are local, political tycoons, who don't need high-ranking positions, but control the appointment of judges, licensing, and law enforcement. These three groups form the invisible framework of power in the Gilded Age. Most notably, these people don't need blatant conspiracies. They don't need secret meetings recorded in official history. The system operates on parallel interests. Lawyers want complex legal structures to make them indispensable. Banks want ever-growing businesses to depend on for capital and credit. The political machine wants money and influence to maintain power. When these three things align, the result isn't an obvious case of corruption, but a new order where the concentration of power becomes the norm. And because that order seems normal, we rarely question it. We look at the richest people and assume they are in control. But that's confusing the system operator with the system designer. The operator may be very rich, very famous, but they still play within the framework. The framework designer is the one who decides how the game unfolds. For the next 60 minutes, we'll do something most stories about the Gilded Age don't. We'll look away from the statues and down to the foundations. We'll follow the trail of deliberately forgotten people, people who understood that true power lies not in being admired, but in being unseen. And when you understand what they did, you'll no longer see the Gilded Age or power in the modern world in the old way. To understand who truly controlled the Gilded Age, we need to clarify a fundamental misconception that most people, and popular history in general, often fall into the confusion between operational power and structural power. These two types of power are not the same, and the wielder of the latter is almost always less well known. Operational power is the most visible aspect. It's the power of the business owner, building factories, opening railroads, hiring workers, signing contracts, selling products. This is the power Carnegie wielded in the steel mills, Rockefeller in the oil refining network, and Vanderbilt on the railroads. They made decisions every day, and those decisions directly affected thousands, even millions, of people. Therefore, they appeared in newspapers, in paintings, and in stories of success and ambition. But behind operational power lies another layer of power, less ostentatious, but far deeper and more enduring: structural power. This isn't the power to decide what you do today, but the power to decide what you are allowed to do in principle. It lies in the law, in the financial mechanisms, in how the state enforces or doesn't enforce regulations. Those who wield structural power don't need to run any company. They run the conditions under which every company exists. Imagine a game of chess. A skilled player might win many games, but it's the rule makers who decide which pieces are strong, which are weak, how long the game will be, and how to win. In Gilded Age, the industrial tycoons are the skilled players. But the people who write company rules, who control credit, and who decide who gets to be judges are the ones who design the chessboard. This difference explains why many wealthy entrepreneurs can still fail if they go against the structure. You might have an efficient factory, but if the law prohibits you from owning a competitor's company, you can't consolidate the industry. You might have a large market share, but if the bank refuses to lend at a crucial moment, you'll be acquired by a competitor. You might have the money, but if the city government delays permits, imposes endless inspections and audits, your project will slowly die without any official ruling. Those in positions of structural power understood this very well. They didn't need to dictate what Rockefeller should do. They simply needed to shape the environment so that choices that benefited them became the only logical options. When the law allowed holding companies, mergers became the legitimate business solution. When credit was allocated according to certain relationships, businesses automatically gravitated toward the right center of power. When judges and prosecutors were appointed through political networks, challenging the system became far riskier than cooperating. The most subtle aspect of structural power is that it doesn't require overt coercion. No one needs to say, "You must do this." The system is designed so that if you don't, you automatically disqualify yourself. And because there are no explicit commands, the system can always deny responsibility. Lawyers say they only write legal laws. Banks say they only make commercial decisions. Politicians say they only follow administrative procedures. Each piece is reasonable, but the whole creates an order where power is concentrated in the hands of very few people. That's why those in positions of structural power often avoid the spotlight. They understand that the less attention they receive, the more space they have to design. Fame brings short-term influence, but also scrutiny, criticism, and resistance. Conversely, anonymity allows you to silently shape the rules of the game, and then everyone acts according to those rules without knowing who wrote them. In the Gilded Age, the distinction between these two power strata created an illusion that lasted for over a century. We look at the wealthiest and assume they are in control. But when you dig deeper, you find that they too are bound by structures they didn't create themselves. They are the adept operators within a pre-designed system. And when you begin to look at history this way, the central question shifts. It's no longer who is the richest or who is the most famous, but rather, who wrote the laws that allowed that wealth to exist? Who controlled the flow of money that fueled it? And who ensured the system was protected when challenged? That is the question that will lead us deeper into the Gilded Age. Beginning with the first and least noticed pillar of power, the lawyers who quietly designed the legal architecture of the entire era. When you hear the word lawyer, the familiar image is usually someone standing before a court, arguing who is right and who is wrong, or an advisor helping businesses comply with the law. But in Gilded Age, the most important role of a lawyer is not in interpreting existing law. It is in creating a new kind of law, flexible enough to serve an economy that is centralizing at an unprecedented pace. Prior to the end of the 19th century, American company law still bore the hallmarks of a small and fragmented economy. Companies were often limited in their scope of operation, geographical reach, and especially their ability to own other companies. Many states considered it dangerous for one company to acquire shares in another, as it paved the way for monopolies and market manipulation. These barriers were not accidental. They reflected a long-standing American concern that concentrated power, particularly economic power, could threaten democracy. But by the Gilded Age, those barriers became major obstacles for businesses seeking to expand nationally. Industrialists didn't just want to compete, they wanted to eliminate competition. They wanted to control prices, stabilize profits, and reduce risk. And to do that without resorting to violence or blatant violations of the law, they needed a more sophisticated weapon: legal architecture. This is where corporate lawyers emerged in a completely new role. Instead of asking, "What does the law allow us to do?" they asked, "How does the law need to change for this to be legal?" This shift in thinking was one of the most significant turning points of the Gilded Age. Lawyers were no longer followers of businesses, they became pioneers. They began with seemingly minor and technical changes, amending company formation laws, expanding the powers of boards of directors, allowing companies to own shares in other companies, and loosening restrictions on business purposes. These provisions didn't attract much public attention because they were presented as reforms aimed at modernizing the law to keep pace with economic growth. But their consequences were enormous. They created the legal basis for structures that had never existed before: trusts, holding companies, and diversified conglomerates. It's important to understand that these structures don't just help businesses grow, they help them survive. Legal challenges. An overt cartel is easily seen as violating antitrust laws, but a properly formed holding company, with subsidiaries that remain independent on paper, can be defended in court as a legitimate entity. The line between competition and monopoly doesn't disappear, it's redrawn. Gilded Age's lawyers understood perfectly that courts consider not only the economic substance, but also the legal form. If the form is cleverly crafted, the substance can be profoundly altered and still stand. Therefore, they didn't just write contracts, they wrote scripts for future lawsuits. They chose which states to register the company in, where judges were willing to interpret the law broadly. They selected language in the Articles of Incorporation that emphasized the voluntary nature of shareholder participation, reducing the likelihood of being perceived as coercion or collusion. From this perspective, lawyers are not simply serving clients. They are serving a vision of a new economic order where large scale is not only accepted but also protected. As giant corporations emerge and survive legal challenges, that success solidifies the position of the very lawyers who designed them. Each victory in court becomes a precedent. Each precedent makes the new structure seem more normal, more difficult to reverse. And here is the profound paradox of the Gilded Age. The most powerful economic shapers are the ones who rarely appear in public. They don't need factories or armies of workers. Their tools are clauses, precedents, and legal language. When they work best, nobody notices what they've done. The system simply works. By the end of the 19th century, the legal framework they had created was robust enough to support a massive wave of mergers. Hundreds of companies vanished into a few dozen conglomerates. And when that happened, many blamed the industrialists' greed. Few noticed that such greed could only become a sustainable power because it had a carefully designed legal foundation. But the law, however sophisticated, is only half the story. A legal structure still needs energy to function. That energy is money. And control over money, in Gilded Age, rests in the hands of a group of people even more secretive than the lawyers themselves. Laws can open the door to the concentration of power, but laws alone are not enough. A giant corporation cannot form and survive without capital. Factories must be built, railroads must be extended, competitors must be acquired, bonds must be issued. And in Gilded Age, the crucial question is not whether there is money or not, but who decides where the money is injected. Before the Federal Reserve, the U.S. financial system operated on a very different logic than it does today. There was no central bank acting as the lender of last resort. There was no public and transparent mechanism for providing bailouts during crises. Instead, Financial power was concentrated in the hands of a very small group of large banks, particularly in New York. And their most important tool was something few people understood: clearinghouses. On the surface, a clearinghouse is simply a place where banks settle their debts to each other. But in reality, it functions like a private central bank. When the economy is running smoothly, this role goes largely unnoticed. But when a crisis erupts, and the Gilded Age was a time of recurring crises, the clearinghouse becomes a real center of power. In closed rooms, representatives of the major banks meet and make decisions that are not recorded in any public minutes. Which banks are rescued and which are abandoned. These decisions don't just affect financial institutions. They spill over into the entire economy. A bank cut off from support can collapse in days. And when a bank collapses, businesses that depend on its credit are dragged down with it. Conversely, a bank backed by a clearinghouse can continue lending, continue financing its customers, and even acquire the assets of dying competitors at bargain prices. Here, power isn't about who's richest, but about who has the power to supply oxygen during a time of crisis. A business may be highly profitable on paper, but if it can't access cash in time, it will still fail. And those in charge of clearinghouses understand this better than anyone. They know that a crisis isn't just a disaster. It's an opportunity to restructure the market in their favor. In the Gilded Age, banks were not merely financial intermediaries. They were the architects of survival. They decided which industries expanded and which contracted. They decided which entrepreneurs could continue playing the game and which had to sell themselves to others. Through credit, they could shape the entire industrial structure of a nation without enacting any laws. What makes this power particularly difficult to recognize is how it's disguised under the language of commercial decision-making. When a bank refuses to lend, they can cite risk, market conditions, or liquidity. When they choose to bail out another institution, they can say it's for the benefit of system stability. Each individual decision seems reasonable. But when viewed holistically, you see a consistent pattern. Capital flows to businesses that fit the legal and political structure favored by the system. And this is where the first pillar of power intersects. Lawyers designed complex holding company and trust structures. But it was the banks that fueled those structures. A holding company might exist on paper, but only with credit and bonds does it become a tool for mass takeovers. When banks and lawyers are on the same side, mergers are not only legal, but also almost inevitable. However, money and laws don't complete the picture of power. A corporation may be legal and well-funded, but it still needs something very mundane: licenses, franchises, protection from investigations, and bureaucratic hassles. And that's where the third pillar of power comes in: the world of urban political machines, where power doesn't require high-ranking titles, but controls the enforcement of laws on a daily basis. The law might allow it. The bank might provide financing, but there remains a crucial question facing every large business in the Gilded Age. Who allows you to operate in the real world? Who decides whether you can lay railroad tracks down a street, locate a factory near a port, or be granted concessions for electricity, water, or streetcars? Who decides whether you'll be subjected to constant inspections or left alone? Who decides which judge your case will end up with if a dispute arises? The answer doesn't lie in the Constitution. It lies in the hands of urban political machines. The Gilded Age was a period of explosive growth in American cities. Immigration poured in, industrialization accelerated, and city governments became the gateway through which all major economic activity passed. But urban power did not operate according to the idealized image of a democracy in textbooks. In reality, it operated as a tightly organized, hierarchical, disciplined system with clear interests. It was the political machine. The political machine doesn't need to hold the highest positions. They don't need to be president or governor. Their power comes from controlling things that receive little attention but have a direct impact: jobs in the bureaucracy, public contracts, business licenses, and most importantly, the appointment process for judges and prosecutors. When you control who is nominated, who gets promoted, and who is sidelined, you control how the law is applied in practice. The political machine operates on a highly pragmatic basis. They build support networks by providing what people need immediately: jobs, legal assistance, help with immigration procedures, and protection from bureaucratic hurdles. In return, they receive loyalty and votes. Once they have votes, they gain the official power to influence the local government apparatus. And once they control that apparatus, they can decide which businesses will benefit and which will be hindered. For large corporations, this isn't a matter of ethics, but a matter of survival. A railway project, a tram system, or a power plant cannot exist without the approval of the city government. These approvals are rarely outright rejected. Instead, they may be indefinitely delayed, subject to additional paperwork requests, and subjected to constant scrutiny until the project becomes unfeasible. Conversely, a project on the right side can be approved quickly, smoothly, and with virtually no obstacles. What makes the power of the political machine particularly effective is that it doesn't need to openly violate the law. Much of the time, they simply exercise discretion in its enforcement. The law may be the same for everyone on paper, but how it's applied is different. A well-connected business might be seen as compliant. Another might be deemed suspicious and become the target of constant scrutiny. This difference is enough to determine the fate of an entire industry. Here, the connection to the two previous pillars of power becomes clear. Lawyers design the legal structures to ensure businesses stand firm in court. Banks provide capital for businesses to expand and acquire. But the political machine ensures that all of that can run smoothly in daily life. When disputes arise, they influence who sits on the judge's bench. When there is public opposition, they steer how the government responds. When there is a threat of investigation, they slow it down, weaken it, or make it disappear. Therefore, the power of the political machine is not ostentatious but extremely practical. It doesn't generate direct profits like banks, nor does it leave a clear mark like lawyers. But it creates something that both of those pillars need: certainty. Certainty that laws will be interpreted in a way that benefits them. Certainty that investment capital will not be hampered by unexpected administrative obstacles. Certainty that the system will protect those who cooperate with it. When laws, finance, and the political machine all converge, power no longer rests in the hands of a single individual or business. It becomes a self-contained structure where each side reinforces the other. And it is this coordination that transformed the Gilded Age not just into an era of wealthy tycoons, but an era where power was locked in the hands of those who controlled how laws were written, money was allocated, and power was exercised in practice. Up to this point, we've seen the three pillars of power in the Gilded Age: lawyers designing the legal framework, banks controlling the flow of capital, and the political machine deciding its implementation in real life. But the key isn't in each pillar individually. The key lies in how these three pillars are locked together, forming a machine that no individual needs to command, yet everything operates in the same direction. Imagine 3 gears. Each gear rotates for its own benefit. Lawyers want complex legal structures to become irreplaceable. Banks want businesses that grow bigger, borrow more, and become increasingly dependent on credit. The political machine wants cash flow, influence, and power stability. None of them need long-term conspiracies or secret plans. They just need the gears to mesh. When one turns, the other two are forced to turn as well. When lawyers open up the possibility of establishing holding companies, banks immediately see an opportunity to finance acquisitions of unprecedented scale. When banks are willing to pump capital into such structures, the political machine sees businesses large enough to provide contracts, jobs, and a steady stream of political funding. And when the political machine ensures a favorable environment for implementation, lawyers and banks have even more reason to continue expanding the same model. The system reinforces itself. The most dangerous aspect of this machine is that it doesn't require public coercion. There's no written document stating that these three parties must cooperate. Every decision can be justified independently. Lawyers say they're simply exploiting legal loopholes. Banks say they're simply managing risk and profit. The political machine says it's simply following administrative procedures and reflecting the will of the voters. But when you look at the whole chain of events, the result is always the same. Economic power becomes increasingly concentrated and competition shrinks. This system also has a characteristic that makes it extremely sustainable. It rewards compliance and punishes defiance without being overt. A business that follows the system will find everything. Runs smoothly. Capital arrives on time. Licenses are signed quickly. Legal disputes are resolved amicably. Conversely, a business that tries to stay outside will not be directly targeted. They will be gradually worn down. Credit becomes harder to obtain. Procedures take longer. Inspections are more frequent, and legal risks are higher. Ultimately, they will either have to sell themselves or be eliminated from the game. In that context, the famous industrial tycoons look like rulers, but in reality, they too are products of the system. They succeed because they learn how to operate within this machine, not because they control it from the start. When they follow the logic of lawyers, banks, and the political machine, they are supported. When they deviate, they can be limited just like anyone else. The Gilded Age's machine of power had another advantage. It was difficult to attack directly. You could criticize a greedy industrialist. You could investigate a particular company. But how do you attack a system where each part appears legitimate and reasonable? How do you convince the public to be outraged by a legal provision, a credit decision, or an administrative delay? The fragmentation of power was its armor. That's why, when crises occur, this machine doesn't collapse. It capitalizes on the crisis. Crises expose weak businesses, giving banks a pretext to tighten lending, lawyers to restructure, and the political machine to intervene to stabilize. Each time a crisis passes, the market has fewer players, power becomes more concentrated, and the system becomes even harder to reverse. By the end of the 19th century, this three-pillar machine was so complete that it needed no one to command it. It operated on the inertia of self-interest and habit. Those involved didn't need to understand the whole picture. They simply needed to do their part within the existing structure. And it was this anonymity and impersonality that made the system's power more enduring than any single tycoon. But no machine is entirely invisible when it begins to reshape the entire economy. At a certain point, the consequences of the concentration of power become too obvious to ignore. And then, one event exposed how this machine operated more clearly than any theory: the Great Financial Crisis of the 1890s, where structural power not only shaped the markets, but also determined who survived. If you want to see the true power of a system, don't look at it when it's running smoothly. Look at it when it's in crisis. Crisis is when all justifications disappear, all layers of legality peel off, and the only question remaining is, who decides who lives? In 1893, America entered one of the most devastating financial crises in history. Hundreds of banks closed. Businesses went bankrupt en masse. The railroads, the backbone of the economy, collapsed in a chain reaction. Unemployment spread. For ordinary people, it was a disaster. But for the power machine of the Gilded Age, it was a test, and also an opportunity. In an economy without a central bank, when trust disappears, everything hinges on a single question: who will have access to cash? When depositors panic and withdraw their money, banks need immediate liquidity. But liquidity doesn't come by magic. It comes from other banks. And who gets help and who is left behind isn't decided by the free market, but by closed-door meetings within the clearinghouse system. These meetings had no public minutes, no press, no democratic oversight. Just a very small group of representatives from the largest banks sat together and made decisions. Which banks would be granted emergency credit? Which banks would be left to fail? And those decisions, in effect, determined the fate of thousands of businesses that depended on each individual bank. Here, power is no longer an abstract concept. It becomes a very concrete action: opening or closing the valve. A railway company may own thousands of kilometers of track and tens of thousands of employees. But if their bank isn't backed by a clearinghouse, they won't be able to pay their short-term debts. Then, the company isn't just in trouble. It's pushed into forced bankruptcy. And when a large business goes bankrupt, the game shifts to a different stage: the courts and restructuring. This is the moment when the three pillars of power align most closely. The banks decide who is lacking oxygen. The lawyers step in to clean up the mess. The political machine ensures the process unfolds in the desired direction. Bankruptcy in the Gilded Age wasn't just an end. It was a selective rebirth. Businesses entered a state called a receivership, where control was transferred to a court-appointed administrator. Nominally, this person was neutral. In reality, they often came from legal and financial networks, closely tied to the creditor banks themselves. This administrator decided which assets were retained, which were sold, which debts were prioritized, and which shareholders were liquidated. The outcome of this process is rarely random. Bondholders tied to large banks are often protected. Small shareholders, investors outside the network, often lose everything. The businesses that survive emerge from the crisis with a new structure, fewer owners, more centralized, and more dependent on the system that saved them. The important point is, nobody needs to say this is a plan. There's no text that says, use crisis to take over the market. But the results repeat themselves in the same pattern. Crises sweep away the weak and independent. Those left are restructured according to the system's mold. And after each such instance, the market becomes less competitive and power becomes more concentrated. From the outside, people see the collapse of companies and assume it's a natural consequence of the economic cycle. But from the inside, the system understands that a crisis is when power is most clearly exercised. When people panic, decisions are made quickly, with little question, and easily justified by the argument of stability. The 1893 crisis didn't just destroy parts of the American economy, it restructured it. When the storm passed, key industries, especially the railroad, were in the hands of fewer people, more closely tied to large banks, and organized under new legal structures prepared by lawyers. And it is here that we see most clearly who truly controls the Gilded Age. Not those who built businesses during the boom, but those who have the power to decide what happens when things collapse. Those who have the power to choose who is saved and who is sacrificed. In that world, power lies not in how much value you create, but in whether you survive the crisis. But to understand why this system can restructure the entire economy so legally and orderly, we need to delve deeper into the technical tools it uses. These tools are dry and difficult to understand, but they are the key to making the concentration of power than normal. For power to be concentrated without causing an immediate backlash, it needs tools that make that concentration appear normal, even reasonable. In the Gilded Age, 3 technical tools played a key role in transforming a competitive economy into a centralized one: trust, holding company, and financial leverage. They weren't secret plots. They were dry legal and financial structures, complex enough that most of the public wouldn't notice, but effective enough to change the entire game. First, there's the trust. Essentially, a trust is a legal agreement in which shareholders of competing companies agree to transfer their shares to a common group of managers. In return, they receive certificates of profit. On paper, the companies remain separate, but real control is concentrated in the hands of a very small group. Decisions about pricing, output, expansion, or contraction are no longer made independently. Competition isn't openly prohibited. It simply disappears. The subtlety of a trust lies in how it is presented before the law. Lawyers emphasize that shareholders participate voluntarily. No one is coerced. Each person simply delegates their share to manage more effectively. This language allows trusts to exist in a legal gray area, where they are not easily considered a violation of antitrust laws, although the economic impact is clearly one of centralized power. But trusts still have a weakness. They rely on personal agreements and can be challenged if a court decides that the form of trust conceals a cartel. Therefore, the system quickly evolved into an even more streamlined and powerful tool: holding companies. Instead of shareholders entrusting shares, a parent company is established to directly own controlling stakes in other companies. Simply by holding enough shares to control the board of directors, the parent company can run the entire system. Holding companies represent a leap forward because they transform control into legal ownership. There's no longer a need for complex fiduciary agreements. There's no longer a need to conceal joint management. Everything is contained within a legitimate corporate structure, legally registered, protected by articles of incorporation and case law. When the courts accept this form, the concentration of power is no longer the exception. It becomes the norm. The third tool that makes the two above extremely dangerous is financial leverage. Banks understand that you don't need to pay the entire amount to control a business. You only need enough capital to buy control. The rest can be borrowed. and that loan is secured by the assets and cash flow of the acquired business itself. In other words, the system allows you to use someone else's assets to pay for their acquisition. When these three tools combine, the result is a nearly perfect machine for concentrating power. Lawyers design the holding company. Banks lend money to buy controlling stakes. The political machine ensures that the new structure is not hampered by unfavorable licenses or law enforcement. A small group at the top of the pyramid can control a vast fortune at the bottom, while most of the risk is pushed down. The important point is, none of these tools are inherently illegal. Each can be justified as effective, modern, and necessary for growth. But when used together, they create a consequence that the original laws did not foresee or were unwilling to acknowledge: an unprecedented concentration of economic power. By the end of the 19th century, these tools had become so familiar that they were almost invisible. New corporations were formed following the same pattern, as if it were the natural way to organize business. The public watched these companies grow and assumed it was the result of talent and efficiency. Few realized that this talent was amplified by a set of tools deliberately designed to turn large scale into an overwhelming advantage. But when concentration becomes too apparent, when a few structures gain control of key industries across the nation, the system begins to attract unwanted attention. One deal crossed the boundaries of public and political tolerance, forcing the state to question whether these legal tools were destroying the very principles of competition upon which the American economy rested. And that question led straight to an event that would shake the entire power machine of the Gilded Age. Every system of power has a dangerous flaw. When it operates too smoothly, it begins to believe itself invincible. With Gilded Age, that moment arrived at the beginning of the 20th century, when legal and financial tools had become so skillfully employed that those operating the system no longer felt the need to conceal their ambitions. And Northern Securities was the clearest manifestation of that. Self-confidence. Northern Securities is more than just a merger. It's a declaration, a holding company designed to control key railroads in the American North, routes that transport goods, resources, and people across vast areas. If this structure holds, competition in that region will virtually disappear, not in a secret or indirect sense, but in a public and explicit sense. Multiple railroad systems will be placed under unified control. Technically, everything was done right. The holding company was legally established. Shares were exchanged through voluntary agreement. Financing was arranged by leading banks. Top lawyers ensured that the legal language was sophisticated enough to avoid direct hits from antitrust laws. From a systemic perspective, this was just the next step, the logical next step in the concentration process that had been underway for over a decade. But it was the sheer scale and transparency of Northern Securities that set it apart. The public didn't need to read the company's charter or understand the holding mechanism to realize that something enormous was locked into the hands of very few people. Even politicians, accustomed to turning a blind eye, began to feel that if they continued to remain silent, antitrust laws would become a public farce. And for the first time in years, the Gilded Age's power machine faced a variable it didn't entirely control: independent political will. When the administration decided to challenge Northern Securities, it wasn't just a legal case. It was a test. Did antitrust laws truly exist, or were they merely decorative for an already compromised system? The reaction of the financial world shows they have become accustomed to a different world. For years, major issues were resolved through compromise, through secret negotiations, through informal adjustments. When the system was publicly challenged, many believed it was just a show, that everything would eventually be settled as before. That belief reflects the level of power the machine had accumulated. It was no longer used to being said no. But the Northern Securities case didn't disappear. It went straight to the courts, where technical arguments and sophisticated legal structures faced a simple but dangerous question: can legal form conceal a monopoly? For the first time in years, the very form on which the system rested became the target of attack. While the legal outcome of the case remains uncertain, its psychological impact is immediate. It sends a clear signal that the system no longer operates in complete secrecy. What once took place behind closed doors can now be brought to light. Tools once considered secure can now become Evidence. Northern Securities marks a turning point. Not the immediate collapse of the Gilded Age machine, but the moment it was forced to recognize that structural power, however sophisticated, is dependent on the political context. When the context changes, even the most meticulously designed structures can be challenged. And it was at this moment that a larger question began to resonate. In American society, if the law can be bent to serve economic power, who will bend it back? That question didn't just lead to a lawsuit. It opened up a whole new era where the press, reform, and public opinion began to do what the system feared most: make the invisible structures visible. If the Northern Securities was the moment the system of power was challenged from within the state, the years that followed were when it was attacked from a direction it least valued: public opinion. Throughout the Gilded Age, the machine of power operated effectively partly because it was complex, technical, and boring to the average person. Legal provisions, financial structures, the mechanisms for appointing judges, all were too dry to generate public outrage. But that began to change when a group of journalists and reformers learned how to turn the invisible into a story. These people were called muckrakers, the junk pickers, as the irony of the time suggested. But what they did wasn't just picking apart small details. They did something far more dangerous. They pieced together the disparate parts of the system. They didn't just write about a greedy corporation or a corrupt politician. They pointed out patterns. And when people saw the patterns, they could no longer believe that everything was just a coincidence. For the first time, the public read stories showing that monopolies are not merely the result of business acumen, but the product of carefully designed laws, coordinated and selectively enforced. The articles didn't need to understand all the legal techniques to make an impact. They simply needed to ask the right questions. Why is the same behavior called restructuring by a large company, but considered a violation by a small company? Why do antitrust laws exist, but are rarely applied? And why do crises seem to always make the strong stronger and the weak disappear? The danger to the Gilded Age machine doesn't lie in individual articles exposing a particular incident. It lies in the fact that fundamental beliefs are beginning to crack. For decades, the system relied on an implicit assumption that large economic structures are the natural result of progress, that they are too complex to be questioned, and that there are no viable alternatives. As the public began to believe that these structures were products of human choice, and therefore could be altered, the invisible power began to lose its most important disguise. Alongside investigative journalism, a progressive reform movement also emerged. These reformers did not always fully understand the machinery of power, but they sensed its consequences: increasing inequality, stifled competition, and politics dominated by economic interests. They began pushing for seemingly technical changes that had far-reaching impacts: reforming appointment processes, strengthening corporate oversight, increasing financial transparency, and, most importantly, reaffirming the state's role in limiting economic power. For the Gilded Age system, this was the most uncomfortable situation. It couldn't be easily countered. You could threaten a business. You could pressure a politician. But how do you pressure a spreading wave of public opinion? How do you convince the public that the structures they had just seen were inevitable and impossible? The machine designed to operate in silence began to falter when forced to explain itself. This doesn't mean the system collapsed immediately. On the contrary, it adapted. The old tools didn't disappear, but were used more cautiously. Centralization continued, but less ostentatiously. The relationship between law, capital, and politics became more sophisticated, shielded by new layers of language: efficiency, stability, national interest. However, one thing changed permanently. The illusion of absolute invisibility was lost. Once light has shone through, even partially, the system can no longer function with the same degree of confidence as before. The architects of Gilded Age recognized that structural power, however enduring, is dependent on the political and social environment. When that environment changes, what was once considered normal can become a target for reform. And it was during this period that a paradox became more apparent than ever. The most prominent figures of the Gilded Age began to be attacked, investigated, and featured in front-page headlines. Meanwhile, those who had designed much of the system continued to retreat further into the shadows. They didn't disappear. They simply withdrew from the spotlight, leaving history with the big question: when the wave of reform passed, who truly lost power, and who simply changed the form of their power? The answer to that question lies in the fate of the very architects who remained invisible after the peak of the Gilded Age, and in how their legacy continues to live on, even as their names gradually fade into oblivion. As the wave of reforms surged and the Gilded Age drew to a close, the interesting thing wasn't who was publicly defeated, but who disappeared quietly. Famous industrial tycoons became targets of public opinion, the press, and politicians seeking to score points. Their names became synonymous with monopolies, inequality, and the excesses of an era. But those who designed much of the system emerged from the historical narrative almost without a trace. This is not a failure. This is a strategy. The invisible architects of the Gilded Age never sought fame. They needed no monuments or legends. They understood that lasting power doesn't come from being celebrated, but from being part of the structure. When a legal structure is widely accepted, no one asks who wrote it. When a financial mechanism becomes how the market works, no one seeks accountability. When a model of the relationship between business and politics becomes familiar, it is no longer considered a choice, but a reality. Therefore, as pressure for reform intensified, the smartest people didn't try to protect themselves. They let the big names take the hit. Corporations were investigated, broken up, and forced to change their structure. But the fundamental frameworks remained. Holding companies didn't disappear. The relationship between large banks and large businesses didn't end. The influence of lawyers in shaping corporate law didn't diminish. The system didn't collapse. It adapted to survive. This explains why, decades after the Gilded Age, the American economy still bears the distinct hallmarks of that era. Modern corporations look different in form, but the organizational logic is familiar: parent companies, subsidiaries, overlapping ownership structures, financial leverage, political influence legitimized through lobbying. These are not new inventions. They are a continuation, refinement, and formalization of what was designed in the late 19th century. It is noteworthy that, when history is recounted, the focus is often placed on this adjustment as a victory for reform. And to some extent, that is true. Antitrust laws were enforced more strictly. The state played a larger role. Overly blatant practices were restricted. But at the same time, the very persistence of core structures shows that reform was not a complete dismantling, but rather a negotiation process between power and limits. The architects of the Gilded Age understood this early on. They didn't build power around a single person or company. They built power around organizational principles. And principles, once deeply ingrained in laws and habits, outlast any individual. People die, reputations fade, but the structure continues to function, often more quietly and effectively. There's a paradox here that history rarely highlights. The wealthiest of the Gilded Age left tangible legacies: houses, charitable foundations, names inscribed on libraries and schools. Meanwhile, the most powerful left intangible legacies: how businesses were organized, how capital was allocated, how laws were interpreted. This intangible legacy is far harder to challenge because it has no face to criticize. And so, looking back at the Gilded Age, the crucial question isn't who won or lost the reform struggle. The question is, what remains after that struggle? The answer is an economy where centralized power is still possible, provided it is presented correctly. A political system where economic influence can still flow through legal channels. A system where the coordination between law, capital, and state power is not abolished, but standardized. The invisible architects of Gilded Age may have faded from the historical stage, but they achieved what every power seeker desires. They no longer need to appear. The systems they helped build continue to operate in their place. And that brings us to the ultimate question, a question that transcends Gilded Age. If these structures persist, if this logic of power remains familiar, are we living in a different world, or merely a more sophisticated version of the same game? As we close the chapter on the Gilded Age, the most important thing isn't to remember a few more names that are rarely mentioned in history books. Far more important is changing the way we view power. Because if you're still only looking for power in the richest, the most famous, the most talked about people, then you're very likely looking in the wrong place, just as most Americans were in the Gilded Age. That era was not controlled by those who built factories or laid railroads. It was controlled by those who decided which factories were allowed to exist, which railroads were funded, and who would defend those structures when challenged. These people didn't need to dominate the public. They only needed to dominate the conditions under which power existed. This is the core lesson of Gilded Age. The most enduring power is not the power you see, but the power to shape the choices of others. When laws are written in a certain way, you don't need to force anyone. They will act within that framework on their own. When capital flows through certain channels, you don't need to issue orders. Businesses will adjust to access those channels. When law enforcement relies on networks of appointments and relationships, you don't need to suppress it. Compliance will come naturally. The prominent figures of the Gilded Age understood this, even though they weren't the ones who created it. They learned how to operate within the system and were rewarded with wealth and prestige. But when the system was challenged, they became the first targets. Meanwhile, the designers of the system, lawyers, bankers, political architects, survived because their power wasn't tied to any single face. And this is where history gets unsettling, because this lesson isn't just about the past. If you look at the modern world, you'll see very familiar patterns. Global corporations are still organized in parent-subsidiary structures. Mergers still depend on teams of lawyers designing the terms and choosing the legal battleground. Capital flows remain concentrated in the hands of a few large financial centers, capable of deciding who gets to expand and who gets left behind. And politics, albeit more sophisticated, still plays a decisive role in enforcing or not enforcing limits on economic power. Today, we may no longer have Tammany Hall, but we have lobbying, revolving doors between the state and businesses, and regulations written by the very people who will benefit from them. We may no longer have secret clearinghouses in the old sense, but we have financial networks large enough to shake markets with a single decision. We may no longer have trusts in the 19th century sense, but we have ownership and leverage structures so complex that they are almost impossible for the public to track. If Gilded Age teaches us anything, it's this: don't let power mislead you with ostentation. Those who truly shaped the age rarely stood in the spotlight. They stood where laws were written, where capital was allocated, where rules were enforced or ignored. And as long as those spaces remained out of sight of the masses, structural power continued to exist. Therefore, the final question Gilded Age leaves us with is not a historical one, but a contemporary one. When we are outraged by an individual, a billionaire, a CEO, are we looking in the right direction? Or are we repeating the same mistake, criticizing the performer while the stage remains intact? History remembers Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie because they are memorable. But the Gilded Age was created by people who understood that true power doesn't need to be remembered. It just needs to be embedded in the structure so that it lasts longer than any name, any fortune, any personal legend. And that is why, more than a century later, we are still living with the legacy of the Gilded Age, not in statues or textbooks, but in the way the world operates every day, according to rules of the game that very few people remember who wrote them.